this meeting, and I will send out the recording after. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. It's great to see everyone. You know, this is the first meeting we've had now that we have a little distance from the North Carolina redistricting process. Again, if you just joined, my name is Bree Bro. I'm the digital organizer with All on the Line North Carolina, and All on the Line is a 501c4 campaign to bring citizens across every issue together to win on redistricting in 2021 and beyond. We raise awareness about the harmful impacts of gerrymandering on policymaking, and create and encourage participation in activities to defend our democratic ideals, increase grassroots engagement in the redistricting process. And very excited today to be able to kind of take a look forward, look back a little bit and take a look forward. So we will get going on that. The sort of agenda, just to give you all a little bit of a roadmap that we're gonna do, I'm gonna invite people to introduce themselves in the chat in just a second. We'll take a quick look at, just to kind of refresh, recap what happened in North Carolina, where the maps stand right now and how we got there very briefly. And then we'll invite Marco to talk about some of the states where All on the Line worked this year that had different processes, that had independent commissions, and what that looked like and what we can learn from that. And then we'll just talk through some next steps, and there'll definitely be time for questions. So if folks have questions for if folks have questions for Marco, we'll just stick them in the chat, and we'll also have some time at the end just to connect if anybody has other questions or wants to make announcements about stuff y'all are working on or anything like that. Okay, so first I would love to invite everyone who's here to introduce yourselves in the chat, so we get a sense of who's in the space with us, your name and pronouns, location, where you're joining from. We love to know where folks are joining us from. If you want to lift up any other organizational affiliations you have, that's great. And I would love to hear just something from folks who feel comfortable or have something for this. Like, what was one thing that you found frustrating or challenging about this past redistricting cycle? Love to have you, put that in the chat with your name and pronouns, where you're joining from, and if you want to mention another organization that you're part of as well, that would be great. But what, as you engaged in this past year's process, what did you find frustrating or challenging about our process here in North Carolina? Again, for folks who are maybe just joining, we are recording this meeting, and we'll share the recording out in a follow-up email. And please feel free to put your questions in the chat. My friend Ramona is gonna try to keep an eye on that, and we'll have some time for questions at the end and as we go. So I wanted to just start off by doing a quick kind of redistricting update, talking about where we are right now and how we got here. So this is the congressional map that we have in North Carolina. Ramona is also going to drop a link in the chat where y'all can find these maps on the state legislative website. And if anybody has any questions about that, I'm happy to actually show you on the screen where you can find those at the end. So this congressional map was drawn by special masters by the order of the courts after the maps that were drawn by the legislature were ruled unconstitutional. So it was drawn by special masters and left in place by the North Carolina Supreme Court. It is they're calling it an interim map, which means it may be redrawn after 2022, but this is the final map for 2022 for sure. And this map, it has a high level of partisan symmetry, right, which is something that we haven't always seen in North Carolina. There are 7 likely Republican seats in this map, 5 likely Democratic seats, and 2 real toss-ups. So if anybody has questions about that, feel free to pop them in the chat or raise your hand. But that's our congressional map that we have for 2022. folks have filed. I'll include a link in an email tomorrow with, if you're interested in who's running in these districts, where you can find that information. So this is our current Senate map. This is our Senate map. This map was drawn by Senate Republicans and was passed along party lines. It did pass the court, so it is the map that we have now. It is still a gerrymander. There are likely 18 likely Democratic seats in this map, 28 Republican seats, and 4 toss-ups in this map. It is likely in place for the remainder of the decade, but there is always the possibility of future litigation. And then the House map, this is our North Carolina House map. This map was a compromise map. It was drawn in the House. It was drawn by Republicans and Democrats. They compromised on this map. It passed the chamber with overwhelming bipartisan support. The map does still favor Republicans, but not as egregiously as the maps that had come out initially. And so this is also the map for the next decade, although it is again possible that there could be litigation on this map as well. But it is the map for 2022. And then I just wanted to kind of, since we're going to talk about reform and what that looked like in some other states, I just wanted to kind of recap and refresh our memories about what the redistricting process looks like here in North Carolina. In North Carolina, the legislature draws the maps. The governor can, unlike other bills, the governor does not have a veto in North Carolina. And so whatever party controls the legislature when maps are drawn controls the process here. The districts, some of the things that are true in North Carolina based on our Constitution are that our North Carolina Constitution, the districts are drawn every 10 years unless they're ordered by the court to be drawn more often. They have to be drawn every 10 years in the year following the census. And they cannot be drawn mid-decade unless ordered by the court. The districts have to be contiguous. They have to be equal population. Congressional maps have to be exactly represent exactly equal population. In the legislative maps, there's a 5% plus or minus, but they have to be roughly equal. And our Constitution says that no county should be divided, but that conflicts with the one person, one vote rule. So court cases have figured that out, for now. And so we have precedent that says how we deal with that. But everything, so those are the things that we are true in North Carolina of the redistricting process. You have to have equal population. Counties aren't supposed to be divided, except how the courts have figured out. Everything else is up to the legislature to decide during the redistricting process. So the redistricting committee passes criteria. They can really pass whatever they want and make whatever criteria they want. We saw in this past cycle that they wrote criteria that was very general, so sort of general and malleable that it was really, they were really able to, it didn't really hold them to anything. It was carefully worded to give them leeway when they wanted to when it served them, they could uphold the criteria, and when it didn't, they didn't. They choose how much transparency to have in the process. In this past cycle, there was some transparency that was better than we've had in previous cycles, in that there was a room where they were drawing the maps in public. But we also know that there were maps that those maps were based on that the public never saw. We don't know what kinds of information was being brought into that room to use to draw the maps. And then the maps that were actually ended up being the final maps were drawn completely out of view of the public. So those are the kinds of decisions that the legislature gets to make. And then also about hearings and public input, that is something that is up to the legislature to decide. They historically have held hearings and have offered avenues for public input, but there are no hard and fast rules about how that input has to be heard or implemented, or how many hearings we have or where they are. And so what we saw in this past cycle was that there were hearings that were difficult to get to in times of day that were challenging for people, and then the input that people did give was often, sometimes it was heard and used, but there was a lot of input that was offered that was not heeded in the final maps. And in fact, sometimes the legislature took input out of context and used pieces of input to do something very different than what the person was actually asking for, and then use that to kind of justify the maps that they drew at first. So that's just a little bit about how the process went here this past cycle, to kind of have that in your mind as we're thinking about what the process looked like in other states. And it was really interesting to see how different states' processes went. So with that, we're gonna shift. Maybe we'll take a minute here and just, Ramona, were there any questions or anything in the chat that I should stop and address before we move on?
There was a question a little bit earlier about the two, I'm trying to go back, the two toss-up.
Yeah, Bree, if you could just go through those numbers again, which are solid red, solid blue, and then which are the toss-up districts?
In which map?
I guess we were on the Senate map, congressional map.
Oh, the congressional map. Yeah. So the congressional map, the toss-up districts are District 1 and District 13. And the likely Republican districts are 3, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And the likely Dem districts are 2, 4, 6, 12, and 14.
Okay, good. Thank you.
And Jane, I see your.
I was on a call with Common Cause like 2 days ago, and they mentioned that according to the Constitution, the congressional maps can be drawn as many times as they want in the 10-year period, but it's just the state legislative maps that have to be drawn only once.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, they're but constitutionally, it's the legislative maps can only be drawn every 10 years. The congressional maps, that there is no language that says that, so they theoretically can be drawn mid-decade. Okay, so now I'm very excited to introduce my colleague Marco Dorado. He's the All in the Line Reform Director. And he was previously served as the Colorado State Director during the 2021 redistricting cycle. And he comes to this fighting for fair maps from a desire to just ensure that all communities, especially those that have been often overlooked or suppressed in the voting process, have a fair shot at making their voices heard. He is a graduate of the University of Colorado Boulder and the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington, and I'm very excited for y'all to hear from him about what reform looked like in some of the other states this cycle. So I'll turn it over to you, Marco.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Bree, for that introduction, and thank you so much to everyone who is on the call tonight. I know that the redistricting process in North Carolina is one that you all have fought so hard to make sure that you're able to make your voice heard. And it's a process that has been really tough, but I can't tell you enough how excited I am to see so many people on a Thursday night on this call, debriefing how the process went and really continuing to be engaged in redistricting, even though we are past the map making process. And so Again, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Also, thank you, Bree, for giving me an opportunity to talk a little bit more about commissions and how commission redistricting processes went down across the country. And so, like Bree mentioned, I was previously the Colorado State Director for All on the Line. And since then, I've actually also been working in other commission states across the country. In Colorado, our redistricting process really came to a close in September. And so since then, I've been jumping around different states and working in different states that have commissions draw the maps. And so to give you a quick overview of states across the country that have some sort of redistricting commission, there's a total of 16 states that use any form of a redistricting commission to draw either congressional or state legislative maps. So what that means is across the country, 16 states either use a fully independent commission, a political commission, or an advisory commission to draw maps. And some states use a commission for both congressional and state legislative maps. Some states use it for one or the other, but not both. And so what I want to do today is I've shared with you examples of fully independent political and advisory commissions. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to actually drill down and share a little bit more about what the process looks like in 3 states that All on the Line worked in. Those 3 states are going to be Arizona, Colorado, and Virginia. And so as you can see, so I started working in Colorado as the Colorado State Director. I actually did some work in Virginia before the redistricting process ended there in the winter. And then I also had an opportunity to do some work in Arizona as the map drawing process was coming to a close there at the end of December and in January. Next slide, please. And so the first state I want to talk about, and the state that I'm most well-versed in, is going to be Colorado. So in 2018, Colorado voters approved Amendments Y and Z, which created the Independent Congressional Redistricting Commission and the Independent Legislative Redistricting Commission. So basically what happened is the state legislature referred this ballot initiative, this constitutional amendment, to the ballot. Voters overwhelmingly approved this ballot initiative to create the independent process. And in doing so, they actually created 2 commissions, and it's in the name, right? They created the Congressional Redistricting Commission, and they created the Legislative Redistricting Commission. It's really important in Colorado, and all the trainings that Ramona and I hosted, it was always really important to remind folks there was actually 2 different commissions that were not only independent of the legislature, they were also independent of one another, that were tasked with drawing the congressional maps and tasked with drawing the state Senate and state House maps. The composition of those commissions was the same, and they actually operated again in a very parallel manner, except they were independent of one another. And so each commission consisted of 12 commissioners, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 4 unaffiliated commissioners. And the way that those commissioners became commissioners is basically any member of the public, and there was specific restrictions on who couldn't apply. Basically anyone who had recently been an elected official, ran for office, a lobbyist, or a campaign manager, they couldn't be on the commission. But basically any member of the public submitted an application, and then through a vetting process and an application review process that is outlined in the state constitution that was part of the amendments, 6 members of the commission, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 2 unaffiliated commissioners were selected at random. It was bingo style. Like if you've ever seen bingo style, if you play bingo and you see the little machine they use to pick out the bingo balls, that's literally how the first 6 commissioners were selected. The second set of 6 commissioners, another 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 2 unaffiliated voters, were selected from a short list of applicants that leaders of the state legislature submitted to a judicial panel. This independent judicial panel then selected those members of the commission, and that rounded out the 12 members of the independent congressional and legislative redistricting commissions. What's really important to note as well is that in the amendments that created the commissions, there was also a clause that basically required that as much as possible, when creating the commission, the judicial panel tried to ensure, to the best of their ability, that the commissions reflected Colorado's racial, ethnic, gender, and geographic diversity. And to the geographic diversity point, there was actually a very specific geographical requirements as to where commissioners had to come from. And in addition, no more than two commissioners could come from the same congressional district. So again, really in the spirit of seeking that as many voices from across the state of Colorado were part of the map drawing process. Additionally, there was significant requirements in the Constitution for public input and participation. There was a whole lead up from when the commission first convened to when they drafted their first map that the commission had to seek input on communities of interest. After they drafted an initial map that was drafted by staff, they had to do a series of hearings across the state. They actually had to have 3 hearings per congressional district in order to collect input on those maps, on communities of interest, and on political competitiveness, that then would get them to the point of deliberating on 3 sets of maps that were created by the commission staff that then they would deliberate on and finally vote on. When it came time to vote on final maps, final map approval required the affirmative vote of 8 of the 12 commissioners. And in addition to that, 2 of those 8 votes had to be unaffiliated commissioners. So once all that was said and done, once the maps were approved, there was one last step in Colorado's redistricting process, and that was that the Colorado Supreme Court had to also review the maps and approve them to ensure that not only the maps, but also the process adhered to the standards outlined in the amendments to the Constitution that created this process. And so all that being said, the outcome of the 2021 redistricting process in Colorado, I would say, was a pretty great one, right? We ended up with maps that really reflected the input that was provided, the various communities of interest across the state, and really reflected the nature, the transparent and nature of ensuring public participation in the process. That really led to maps that, again, reflect all of Colorado and really gave us fair maps and a fair shot at electing folks who will best represent the reality of Colorado. So that is the Colorado Commission process. I'm going to share a little bit more now about Arizona and Virginia, and then after that, we can open it up to questions if that works for folks. Perfect. The next commission that I want to talk about is Arizona. And the reason I want to talk about Arizona is because it's very similar to Colorado. However, there are some key differences that led to an outcome that was a little bit different than the outcome in Colorado. And so in Arizona, the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission was actually established in 2000 by a ballot initiative that amended the state's constitution to create the commission. The commission in Arizona, so since then, they've had 2 commissions. Actually, they've had 3 commissions, I'm sorry, 2001, 2011, and 2021. Every decade, it's a new set of commissioners, and the commission is composed of 5 members, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats that are appointed by legislative leaders. Those legislative leaders appoint these 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans from a short list of applicants, members of the public, who submitted their application to the Arizona Commission on Appellate Court Appointments, right? So the Commission on Appellate Court Appointments comes up with this 25-person short list, hands that over to legislative leaders and said, here are the people you can choose from. Democrats, you choose your 2, Republicans, you choose your 2. Once those commissioners are selected, they convene, and those 4 commissioners then select a 5th individual that is not registered as the same party as any of the existing commissioners, right? So an unaffiliated commissioner. What's interesting, and I'm going to add a little bit of commentary here, and a difference from Colorado is that because there's only 5 commissioners and there's only 1 unaffiliated commissioner, it gives a lot of power to that 1 unaffiliated commissioner to really dictate the course of the map drawing process. And I'll get a little bit more into that at the end, but that's really what we ended up seeing in Arizona. Very similar to Colorado, there are requirements for public participation and public input in Arizona's redistricting process. However, a lot of those are up to the commission. The one public input requirement that is required in the Constitution is that whenever the commission arrives at a point where they want to approve a final congressional or state legislative map, they have to have a 30-day public comment period on those draft maps before any final votes take place to approve the map. Any other public input or opportunities for public participation are really at the discretion of the commission. But similarly in Arizona, there's very much this nature of wanting to be accessible to the public and wanting to be transparent. And so there was various opportunities across the state during the cycle in 2021 that the commission accepted public comment, accepted public testimony, and accepted maps from the public that informed their decision-making and map drawing process. Once the commission arrives at the final maps that they approve, this is different than in Colorado. It only requires affirmative vote of 3 out of the 5 commissioners. There's no requirement in terms of like the affiliation of those commissioners. In theory, right, if it's 3 out of 5, you will have some degree of bipartisanship in approving those maps because you have 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 2 unaffiliated commissioners. But once they get at a minimum 3 out of 5 affirmative votes to approve a map, that's it. There's no other review by the Supreme Court. The map is basically enacted. They prepare the shapefiles, they send them to the Secretary of State, and it's all a done deal. That gets us to how the 2021 redistricting process went in Arizona this decade, this in 2021. Even though the maps were drawn by an independent commission, the maps unfortunately did not reflect a lot of the public comment and a lot of the public testimony that was provided. And a lot of this had to do, right, with the fact that because the independent commissioner, the sole independent commissioner, held a lot of power in her position, a lot of the way that she wanted to see the maps drawn is the way that the maps ended up being drawn, regardless of some of that public input. And so in very different to Colorado, right, where in Colorado, there really had to be a critical mass of people on board with how the maps were drawn. That included both Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated voters. Unfortunately, in Arizona, even though, the process was independent, it was probably a better outcome than if the legislature had drawn them. There was still a significant opportunity for more of the public input to be incorporated into the way that the maps were drawn. Another important distinction in Arizona is that this one commission, these 5 commissioners, draw the legislative maps and the congressional maps. That also created dynamics, right? Where because a community is being put in one district on the congressional map, maybe it can go somewhere else, or there could be bargaining on other maps, right? It created those dynamics that didn't necessarily maybe speak to the public comment or the public testimony that the commission received, but definitely impacted then the way that those communities ended up being represented in the maps. So that's a quick rundown on Arizona. If we want to go to the next slide, I'll give you an even quicker rundown on the way that the Virginia process happened in 2021. And I share Virginia last because Virginia is different from Arizona and Colorado in that they are really independent of the state legislature. The Virginia Redistricting Commission is a political commission. And what that means is that there are politicians on this commission. And in Virginia's case, there are members of the public and members of the legislature that together form the commission. And so the Virginia Redistricting Commission was established in 2020. Legislative leaders referred a constitutional ballot initiative to voters. Voters approved it, creating the commission. And the commission was composed of 16 members, 8 legislators, 2 appointed by each of the legislative leaders of each chamber, and 8 citizen commissioners that were selected by a panel of 5 retired state circuit court judges from a list that was provided by legislative leaders. So already there's a lot of political influence in the commission, not only by the fact that there are politicians on the commission, but also really the list of individuals that then go off and serve is a list that is already created by those same legislative leaders. Similar to Colorado and Arizona, there were public input requirements in Virginia. the commission had to have at least 3 hearings in different parts of the state to collect feedback on the communities across the state before proposing any plans and before voting on any plans. Which, like I said, is similar to Arizona and Colorado. But what's different here is once they got to the point of approving maps, they had to send those maps to the state legislature to then also be approved by the state legislature. The state legislature couldn't change the maps, but the legislature would be sort of the final seal of approval as to whether or not the maps were approved. Making things that much more complicated, in order for a map to be approved by the commission and sent to the state legislature for their approval, it required the support of 6 out of the 8 legislative commissioners and 6 out of the 8 citizen commissioners. And for the state legislative maps, they also had to garner 3 of 4 affirmative votes by the legislative commissioners from the chamber that they're considering, the Senate or the House. And so what this all amounted to was a lot of chaos and a lot of gridlock. In 2021, the first year that this new commission system was implemented in Virginia, was one of, like I mentioned, a lot of chaos, a lot of gridlock that actually resulted in the commission not being able to fulfill their job. Once they got to the point of drawing maps and considering maps, Republicans and Democrats on the commission were unable to come to a consensus on what map to send to the legislature, either for the congressional map or for the state House and the state Senate. And so what happened is they basically threw their hands up and said, we can't do this. And so at that point, the Supreme Court of the state of Virginia intervened, and the Supreme Court then took over the process of redrawing maps. They appointed 2 special masters, one recommended by Democrats, one recommended by Republicans. Those 2 special masters ended up drawing the 3 sets of maps. And those were the maps that then the court approved and are now going to be enacted for the next 10 years. And so ultimately, I would argue those maps are a better outcome than what the legislature would have drawn. They wouldn't have been gerrymandered in the way that the legislature would have drawn them. There were also a different outcome, obviously, than the maps that the commission was gridlocked on. But unfortunately, right, because then this process went to the Supreme Court and they had their map drawers draw the maps, it was really void of really robust opportunities for public participation in the way that processes like Arizona and Colorado had, for example. And so that is the overview of the different commissions, just a sample of the different commissions and how the cycle went in 2021 across the country. Obviously, there's other states that have commissions like Utah, New Mexico. Michigan's is very similar to Colorado's, but very much happy to open it up for questions that anyone might have about commissions and pros and cons and how they worked in 2021.
Thank you, Marco. That was very interesting. I have not heard it summarized like that, so that was very interesting to me as well. I know that was a lot of information. Does anybody have questions?
Yeah, boiling it down, I guess, is the you guys that work with this all the time and have seen various, structuring it various ways, creating it various ways. Is it your, and I don't know how long commissions have been used to sort of, come up with maps. How long has that process been going on?
That's a really good question. I think that Arizona is the first state to have a fully independent redistricting commission, because I'm trying to think California has a redistricting commission as well, but I think 2010 was the first time that they were around. So relatively new.
So we have only about a 10-year, really one shot at this, give or take. Do we have a sense of which method works better for everyone, or do we really don't have enough data to know that yet?
That's a really good question. Right now, we're in the process of really evaluating and thinking through what redistricting model is the sort of the best model that really helps maximize public participation, transparency, and results in fair maps. And so I can't give you a solid answer right now, but what I can tell you is that those states that prioritize those elements that I just mentioned, right? Public participation, transparency, independence from political actors, right? And to a certain extent, codifying the requirements and being specific about those criteria in map drawing, those are states that are really successful. I'll give you an example from Colorado and Arizona, right? In Colorado, communities of interest, keeping communities of interest whole is one of the constitutional criteria before political competitiveness. Communities of interest are defined in the Colorado Constitution. In Arizona, communities of interest are also sort of a priority criteria, but communities of interest are not defined in the Arizona Constitution. And so what happened in Arizona was commissioners were saying, well, hey, I go golfing 30 miles down the road, that's my community of interest. Whereas in Colorado, because a community of interest was defined to being communities that share basically that share interests of policy interest, that really helped define like what should we be thinking of as a community of interest, and not really labeling whatever's convenient for us to label as communities of interest. So that's just, yeah, and like I said, we're not really at the point yet to say like, what is the best? We're working on that, but I think there's definitely elements of what is a process that maximizes transparency, public participation, and an opportunity to arrive at fair maps.
Yeah, coming up with the metrics that you want to use to make that decision is part of the process, you know, so, okay. Thanks.
Yeah. I think I see a question from Chris. Which state is doing independent commissions well? You know, I think California did a great job with their commission. They had, it was really interesting, right? They had a lot of pushback because of potentially the impact that some draft maps could have on the ability of Latino and Black voters to elect candidates of their choice. And a lot of the public input and public participation really helped ensure that they were on the right track. I would put Colorado in that category as well, right? Colorado, I think when the maps got to the Supreme Court, there was some challenge, there was briefs filed in support and against, but ultimately, right, the process went as it was supposed to go, resulted in fair maps, and there wasn't much of any issue really at the conclusion. And so I really would look at places like Colorado and California for sure as being places that have really solid independent commissions. And at the state level.
And yes,
Thank you,
again,
Marco.
the local level is a whole other issue here and in California and everywhere.
I guess at the root of my question earlier is, do we have enough of an understanding and enough trials at this to make a definitive statement that independent commissions are clearly a better way to go?
Again, I would argue that we probably have enough instances where commissions have been used that we could arrive at like a really sound evaluation. I haven't done the evaluation yet. I'm a big fan of public participation, transparency, and fair maps. So I would say, look, you know, commissions are the gold standard, but they have to be done correctly, right? They have to be independent. They have to be very thought out in order to be successful. And so I think we are getting to a place where we have different examples of what a commission can look like, that we can start deducing from that. Well, what are those elements? We just haven't done, right? We just haven't gotten to the point where we're saying, okay, what are those elements that have been tested that we think are really good for that? And what are the elements that maybe are not so good for those factors that we want to consider?
Yeah, exactly. We don't have enough of it. That's why I asked my question. We don't have enough of a track record to really be able to determine what are the proper metrics and how should they be applied. Because otherwise you can have a commission I've heard talk of this, I don't know enough detail, that you can have a commission that screws it up as much as a legislature does if you're doing it wrong. So Yeah, it's your metrics. Thanks.
Helen asks a question in the chat. Am I correct in recalling that in order to establish a redistricting commission in North Carolina, we would need a constitutional amendment? I don't know if you know for sure, Marco. I believe that that is true because in our constitution, the constitution currently gives that power to draw maps to the legislature. So I think we would have to amend the constitution. And in North Carolina, unlike in some other states, you can't, the legislature has to put a amendment on the ballot. You can't do it with like, voters can't do that themselves.
Yep.
And I think that's a great question, Tina. Is there any movement to support a constitutional amendment on this topic in North Carolina? I know that there are groups that have been working on redistricting and have talked about reform in the past who are talking about it again. But I don't know beyond that, if there's what kind of a movement currently exists as yet. Do you want to take this question from Jack, Marco?
Once you have a sense of how independent commissions best work, we'll create template legislation that could be used at the state level. That's a really great question, Jack. I think that in order to sort of try to implement that across the country, I think it requires a lot of context as to how, what mechanism is the best mechanism first and foremost, right? To create reform and to pass a commission. And so I get the sense, that potentially is end goal in thinking about how do we make sure that as many Americans across the country have an ability to have a process that is independent. I just don't know that we're at that place just yet, but I think that's like that would be a goal.
And in responding to Tina's follow-up, do we have to create a movement to support a constitutional amendment on this topic? I don't know all the conversations that are being had, so it's possible that there is a movement. But I think that if this is something that we should, that's why we're talking about it now, that, I do know that there's a lot of polling that suggests that North Carolinians are very unhappy with gerrymandering and with the process that plays out in the legislature.
Yeah, and one thing that I'll share about our experience in Colorado is that when the commission was created in 2018, amendments Y and Z passed with overwhelming support from folks on both sides of the aisle, right? So this is an issue that has bipartisan support in the general public. And so I feel like, especially with creating people-powered momentum, it's one of those sort of low-hanging fruits that we shouldn't let it escape it. We shouldn't let that momentum escape.
Definitely. Are there any other questions in this moment? I'm going to move on to the next slide because I think it's my kind of next steps wrap up slide. And then I'll take the slides down, and if folks want, if I know that there's a lot of information and sometimes you might, as you process, might have more questions. So we'll open it back up for questions in a minute. So just keep that in mind. Thanks for all those questions, y'all. Those were really good questions. And I'm really intrigued by this conversation. And thank you very much, Marco, for sharing your knowledge with us on this. I've been very excited to hear about how these commissions actually worked and what they looked like. Let's see here. Oh, this was the slide for questions. We've done that. So I did want to just share a couple more things. Number one, Ramona is going to drop a link to a very short kind of feedback form survey. We're in the process right now as our processes wrap up of really reflecting on what we did, spending some very intentional time, looking at what we did, what worked, what we learned. And it would be really helpful to hear from y'all, things that you found helpful or that were good, and also things that you know, we could have done differently, or we should think about as we prepare for, you know, future redistricting processes. And also it's like just a few questions in that survey. It should take you like, you know, 5 minutes probably. But what worked well? What should we keep in mind for you know, thinking about how we could do things differently or better? And what do y'all feel like, what either are you already working on, or what would you like to see all on the line kind of doing as we go forward in this process? What's the work look like in your opinions? Because, you know, people on this call, there's 50 people on this call, and I see a lot of you, and y'all are, you know, there were a lot of people who did a lot of work this past year, and a lot of them are on this call. And so we really want to hear your, you know, your feedback and what you're thinking about in terms of what should come next. And so please do that. I will include that link also in the follow-up email, but you can grab it out of the chat now if you just want to get it done and don't overthink it. And it doesn't have to be pretty. It's just, you know, we're just the ones that are going to see it, and you can put your name or not. And we really, really do look at that feedback and appreciate it. And I just love feedback, y'all. You know that about me. So I really appreciate taking the time to do that. Also, we are still tentatively looking at doing some kind of a Fair Map Summit like we did last year. We are just, like I said, since we're in the process of wrapping up and reflecting and planning, I don't have the date for that, but I hopefully we'll be able to share more about that soon. But just be on the lookout for that. I'll still continue to send newsletters as there's stuff to share. And I do have another meeting, went ahead and scheduled a meeting for April so that we can just go ahead and get that on the calendar to come together again and talk about, you know, what's coming next. So Ramona will drop that link, and it will also be included in the email. And I think that is everything we had planned. But I did also just want to invite, I know there's a lot of folks here who are doing work, and if anybody has, you know, announcements or things you want to share in this space about work you're doing, I've gotten emails from folks about, you know, counties looking for election workers and things like that. Anything, you know, that supports democracy that you want to share here. I just want to open up the space for questions, announcements, anything like that folks want to unmute or put and share or put in the chat. Or if you have any more questions for Marco. Yeah, Helen, I see Helen's question in the chat, and that's also something I'm interested in and thinking about as we get closer to election day, and folks are, you know, thinking about their voting when they find out their district has changed, you know, that's always a frustration. And especially, you know, when we think about the fact that like there's a likelihood that these, especially the congressional maps, will change again. I think that's something that people get very frustrated with. It's definitely, I think, contributes to voter suppression. And I would love to think about, you know, what we can do to assuage that frustration, or to channel that frustration into some kind of action. And thank you, folks who are putting nice things in the chat. That's very nice. Appreciate that. All right. Well, I think, oh, I see hands. Are those hands from Jane? Do you have a hand? Hi, Jane.
Hi. There are a few people on the call tonight from my neck of the woods out west. So I just thought I'd let you know that I'm doing a presentation on an update on all the redistricting and the candidates who have filed to run, especially in our areas. And I'm doing it for the local Jackson County chapter of Democratic Women next next Thursday, a week from today at noon. It'll be a hybrid meeting, both in person at our headquarters and with a Zoom link. So I didn't know if maybe Jean Wright might be interested, or Karen Smith. I'm working really hard to get a real good presentation done for everybody.
That's great,
Thank you.
Jane. Do you have a
Thank
link
you.
or something you could pop in the chat?
I don't have the Zoom link yet, but I'll make a note that you should get it.
Send it to me. Yeah, I'll share it.
Would Mitchell County be included, Jane? Or does
Oh, gosh, Mitchell,
Yancey?
you're in
Mitchell,
District
Avery?
11, aren't you?
Yeah.
I get Madison and Mitchell mixed up. Which one got kicked out of District 11?
I believe Madison.
Okay. I will be talking about District 11.
Okay.
John, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I was just curious, while I have all these experts on the phone, if you had any reaction to the Supreme Court ruling on Wisconsin, which seems so counter to what they did in Alabama. At least to me.
That is a really good question. I think that Bree, Ramona, myself, just like you, John, probably very confused, especially given the Supreme Court's ruling on Alabama last month, and that they really wouldn't step in on the case now because it's too close to the election. And so I don't have my reaction is confusion. I'm not an expert in law, and so I can't provide that reaction, but I think confusion is a good word to define how I'm feeling in my reaction.
Yeah, my reaction's purely partisan. Don't come after me and tell me that Supreme Court isn't partisan. Sorry, just the cynic in me.
Yeah, it definitely feels concerning. Concerning is is the word of the day for me on that. But I'm also not a lawyer, and I don't feel like I can, give any good analysis, unfortunately.
And that was Alabama and what other state?
So there were
Wisconsin,
rulings out of Alabama. And which other state did you say, Marco?
Sorry,
Wisconsin.
Alabama and Wisconsin.
So the ruling that just came down yesterday was Wisconsin, and then there had been a ruling previous in Alabama.
and essentially in Alabama, they said, well, we can't stop this now because it's too close to elections. So they actually, I think in Alabama, well, anyway, they ruled in favor of the Republicans because they said it was too close to elections to change it, not because they necessarily thought they were fair maps. And in Wisconsin, where my understanding was that the Supreme Court of Wisconsin approved these maps and they were all set when they got challenged by the Republicans and sent up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, and since they did it on the shadow docket, we don't have any explanation of the legal reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
Suddenly ruled in favor of the Republicans. So, to try to explain how that isn't partisan is just boggles the mind, at least my mind.
And just a little clarification, in Alabama, it was in relation to the congressional map, and they basically said, we're going to hear the case. We're just not going to hear the case this year because it's too close to the election. So they didn't close the door on hearing the case. They just delayed when they're going to hear it until after 2022. In Wisconsin, the state Supreme Court there ruled on a set of maps. The Supreme Court, the ruling that John is referencing, the Supreme Court came back and said the state legislative maps, the state Supreme Court needs to go back and rework those because of the issue. I believe it was a VRA issue with those maps. However, they left the congressional map untouched.
So they did half and half. They half approved and half have to be done. Is that right?
Right.
In Wisconsin. Yep.
The thing that makes it even more confusing, at one level, you thought that if the Supreme Court's going to get involved, it's more likely to be the congressional maps because, yeah, you know, that's a national election, and the other is all within state, and it's a state election. But now, and I think most of the conservatives on the Supreme Court seem to think all this ought to just be left to the state legislatures. I mean, it's just crazy.
That's another thing coming down the pike that
Yeah.
we'll be paying attention to. All right, y'all. Well, it is just about 7 o'clock, and I want to respect everyone's time. I do really appreciate everyone joining tonight, and big thank you to Marco and Ramona for helping out, and Marco for very interesting information about those commissions. We will definitely be thinking a lot about this as we go forward in North Carolina. That's right, onward. We'll see y'all in.
Thank you, Brianna. Great job.
Thank you. Thanks, y'all. You'll get an
Good
email from me in the next couple of days with, you know, links and everything, and feel free to reply if you have questions or want to set up a time to chat. All right. Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you again.
Thank you again and again and again.
Thanks, y'all.
Talk
Good
soon.
weekend.
Thank you. You too.